Chapter 23. As they left the King of Fire, Lakashtai drew up her hood, hiding her face in deep shadow.
"Tell me everything," she said. "How did this begin? What do you know of this hostile spirit?"
My companions and I were attacked last night on the streets of High Walls. It seemed like a simple mugging, but the leader, he had this strange laugh that seemed to get into my head, making it difficult to concentrate. After we'd brought down his allies, well, I don't know what he did exactly. I was overwhelmed with this rush of thoughts and emotions, as if he were pouring his entire life into me. Then we both blacked out.
"This was almost 24 hours ago."
"Yes."
"We should have privacy. This will have to do."
They'd come to a building that was apparently an inn. Like many of the structures in the Folly, it was one of the strangest buildings Dane had ever seen. The walls seemed to be made out of thick crystal, and the torches inside the building spread a glowing radiance across the entire structure. There were no windows, though. In a sense, the entire building was one large window. Dane could see people moving about inside, though the distorting effect of the thick crystal walls obscured details. Stepping inside, they found that the entire building was made of crystal. The surface of the floors was rough, providing traction and a high degree of opacity, but floors, walls, ceiling, all were solid glass. Dane wondered how such a thing could ever be constructed. Undoubtedly, Lay would know. The furnishings were standard wood and brass, and would have been at home in any Brelish farmhold. Somehow, the presence of such mundane furnishings only enhanced the bizarre nature of the architecture. A young man with long white hair approached them as they entered. At first, he seemed to be wearing a simple white shirt and a pair of brown breeches, but as he came closer, Dane saw a faint motion in the air around him, and realized the man was also wearing a great coat woven from invisible cloth. "Welcome to the Glass House, travelers," the host said. "If you have come for the evening meal, we are serving the finest ghost fish in Sharn this evening, along with—"
"A room is all we require,"
Lakashtai said. She produced a platinum coin that would have bought a month's stay in the Manticore.
"Time is of the essence."
The host's eyes gleamed, and the coin quickly vanished. "Please, follow me, travelers." The walls were made of glass, but the doors were rough wood, and they almost seemed to be floating amidst the firelit crystal. The room itself was surprisingly sparse, though Dane imagined what Lay might say if she heard that he'd been in a room with a real bed. Embedded in the wall was an ever-bright lantern with a shutter to hide the light from sleeping eyes.
"Lie down,"
Lakashtai commanded. Her words were a song, but there was iron behind the music. She drew her hood away from her face.
"Continue your story. What became of the man who attacked you?"
He fell into a coma. Then, about an hour ago, I thought I saw him on the street. But apparently, I'd passed out, and the encounter was all in my mind. We fought, and I managed to defeat him. But I doubt the trick I used would work a second time."
"The physical conflict is only a metaphor," Lakashtai said. "But you are correct. The longer the spirit stays within you, the more power it will gain, and the harder it will be to overcome. You cannot resist it forever."
They nodded glumly. "I figured as much. Is there anything that can be done?"
"I have a friend who can help you," Lakashtai said. "If you are willing, She can reach your mind and attempt to excise the foreign spirit. It's dangerous, but
What choice do I have? Dane said. So what's the price of my freedom? I've told you. I don't have coin to spare. I'd have to sell my sword to pay back the price of this room, and it isn't even my sword. Lakashtai raised his chin with a finger and stared into his eyes. Her skin was smooth and slightly cold, and as before, her gaze was deep and hypnotic. She released him and looked away.
my people were engaged in spiritual warfare long before the rise of Galifar, before your seer ever existed. You cannot put a price on a soul. I will help you, because I can.
She looked back at him.
All I can ask is that if I should need your help in the future, you remember what I have done for you.
Very well. Dane didn't like the thought of being indebted to anyone, and the situation was unfolding with remarkable speed. But he could feel Monan's power growing, could hear the changeling's voice whispering in the back of his mind, and he felt flashes of emotion that had nothing to do with his own desires. What do I do?
Lie back. Let your thoughts wander. By now, your enemy will be gathering his power, preparing for his next attack. Don't try to resist. Whatever happens, whatever threat he presents, don't fight back. Let my friend handle everything.
She leaned in close to him, and for a moment Dane thought she was going to kiss him. Instead, she touched her forehead to his. Her eyes filled his view, and her scent filled his mind, strange and exotic, yet somehow intimately familiar. An old friend he had forgotten.
Let go,
she said, and he fell into her eyes.
So, here we are again.
He was outside the manticore, and Monan's voice rang through the air. The changeling was leaning against the door of the inn. Dane said nothing.
Your grandfather was a poor choice, said Monan, walking toward him. Perhaps he was a professional soldier, but you were used to fighting him, and that was my mistake. But there are so many weapons I can use against you.
The surroundings changed, and Dane found himself in a luxurious manor, Alina Lyris's estate in Metrol, which Dane hadn't seen for 8 years. The floors were covered with soft bearskin, the air filled with a scent of cinnamon and rich perfumes. Dane knew what Monan was trying to do, and he expected to hear Alina's voice next, but it was Lay who appeared nearby.
Now what do you suppose I would do if I knew about this? Lay said. I never thought you were capable of such things, Dane. But neither did you, did you? Does it still trouble you, or has the war burned the shame from your system?
She came closer, and Dane saw a glint of metal in her hand. A knife? Instinct brought his hand to the hilt of his sword, but memory weighted down his thoughts. Why fight it? Despite his best efforts, what difference had he made over the last 8 years? Seer was gone, and he was working for Alina again. What was the point? But even as he let go of his sword, even as Lay came closer, he felt a presence, something fundamentally other.
Look away, Dane. Close your eyes.
The thoughts came from within his own mind, yet he knew they were Lakashtai's. Even as he glanced away, he saw a shadow falling over the false Lay, saw a look of pure terror on her face. He closed his eyes. There was a horrible gurgling scream, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, it was still Lay's voice. It was a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come. When Dane opened his eyes, he was lying on a soft bed in a room of glowing crystal. He felt no trace of Monin in his mind, and Lakashtai was nowhere to be seen. A small shard of green crystal was on the bed next to him. He picked it up. It was cool to the touch, and for a moment he felt the touch of Kalashtar fingers on his hand. He slipped the crystal into his belt pouch, picked up his cloak, and left the glowing room for the dark streets below. Chapter 33. The sun had set over Sharn, but the towers were alive with light. Lay looked over the railing and was stunned by the sight. The spires of the tallest towers were the playgrounds of the wealthy. Buildings of crystal and gold glittered in the light of magical fire. She could see a long pool of water atop one tower and a grove of ancient trees atop another. Private pieces of nature hidden amidst the city. Looking down the length of the tower was a lesson in architectural style. Every few hundred feet, structures and materials changed as each tower and ward reflected the traditions of a different era or culture. There was no shortage of light on the deck of the Pride of the Storm. The ship's railings were studded with crystal shards charged with cold fire, but these tiny torches were overshadowed by the enormous ring of elemental fire wrapped around the waist of the ship. The light from this belt of flame almost a match for the sun itself. There were a dozen Lirundar servants scattered around the deck, polishing the railings and performing other forms of maintenance. But there were also a few guests, and after taking Lay's pack, the chief servant led Lay and Pierce to the small knot of guests, one of which was a massive owl standing midship beneath the flaming arch.
"Master Callis," the servant said, "your guest has arrived."
Leyland Callis was an enormous man, at least in girth. His long beard was dyed in various shades of blue, matching the swirling patterns of his loose robes.
"Lay!"
he bellowed, charging forward and embracing her. The small group of people watched him go with looks of mild bemusement.
"What a wonderful surprise!"
"Surprise?"
Lay said, breaking free and gasping for breath.
"From your note, it seemed a matter of fate."
Leyland's face split in a massive grin.
"Well, yes, that's because you didn't see the note I left last night, or this afternoon."
"What do you mean?"
"A friend told me you were in town and would be coming to visit, but I had no idea you might arrive. I've been leaving notes for you every time I leave the house."
Lay smiled.
"And my companion?"
"As if you would be traveling alone, my dear."
Leyland studied Pierce with a curious eye.
"Although, I must admit, I rather expected you to be in the company of a handsome young man. No offense meant."
"None taken," Pierce rumbled.
"And here I thought you'd finally unlock the secrets of the stars and the moons, Leyland. Nonetheless, I thank you for making me feel welcome. After what we've been through recently, it's wonderful to have a chance to socialize."
"And on that note,"
he said as he led Lay and Pierce to the small group. He made a brief round of introductions of various merchants and finally turned to the owl.
"allow me to introduce my companion of the moment. Master Huhurn makes his home in the bazaar of Middle Dura. Without question, he is one of the cleverest birds I have ever crossed wits with."
"Too kind, Leyland," Huurn said, standing almost 9 feet tall from the tips of his talons to the tufted horns. Huurn was the largest owl Lay had ever seen, covered with gray-black feathers. He regarded Lay with yellow eyes the size of small saucers.
"Lay, is it? You would be House of Canith, my lady.
His voice was strange and inhuman, deep, fluting tones twisted to form words. Leyland caught Lay's eye and spoke before she could answer.
Hoorn used to be a wind chaser in the sporting events of Dura. I've forgotten. Did you ever actually win a match, old owl?
The owl rotated his head to face Leyland, a slightly disconcerting effect.
Indeed, this is well known. Difficult for the owl to race the Pegasus, but not impossible with proper plans and arrangements. My people admire such effort.
Your people, Lay said. Are there really so many owls in Sharn?
Less than a dozen. Mine are the people of the bazaar, merchants, and others who know the value of word and wit. It took diplomacy to overcome the griffin and the hippogriff. Now, those same gifts are used in the service of Dura. But as to you, I should probably introduce Lay to our host, Hoorn. It's her first time aboard the Pride, you know. Very well,
the owl bobbed his head.
Perhaps we shall talk later, Lay.
Leyland took Lay's arm and led her to a set of stairs. Pierce followed behind.
A fascinating fellow, Hoorn. But he's a hunter by nature. I didn't think he'd latch on to your house so quickly.
So, what do you know of my situation, Leyland? And who told you I was in Sharn to begin with?
Her name is Flamewind.
The Sphinx.
Lay tried to imagine Leyland fighting a minotaur bare-handed and failed completely.
Ah yes, that's her. She spends a certain amount of time at Margrave University.
This was what Lay had heard in the first stories of the Sphinx.
Talking about Zendrick?
Ah, yes.
Lay wondered why Flamewind maintained two homes. The temple in Malian's Gate was a fairly elaborate stage, if she could just be found in the Morgrave Library. But then again, many mystical powers were linked to specific locations. If Flamewind was a true oracle, perhaps she channeled some hidden power in the temple to obtain the knowledge of the future and the past.
What did she tell you?
That you are in Sharn, no longer part of House Canith, and that you would be visiting in the future. She'd never spoken to me before. I've seen her certainly, but we've never spoken. I've heard she eats people who ask her stupid questions, and I've never felt like taking that chance.
Food for thought.
Well, exactly.
They descended a large spiral staircase into an elaborate ballroom. Both the staircase and the room below were massive in scale, and Lay imagined that they had been designed to accommodate large guests like Hoorn or an ogre servant. The ceilings were at least 20 feet high, and Lay wondered if the chamber was making use of two decks. Light fell from glittering chandeliers, each crystal shard enchanted with its own spell of light. Lay was impressed. All magic had its price, and clearly expense was not a concern for the heirs of Lyrandar.
Thank you for not mentioning my disgrace to the owl, Lay said.
She saw a long table filled with food and started toward it.
Well, if it's what I think, I know you're not allowed to lie about it. But if you'd like, well, a friend who simply hasn't heard the news and mistakenly misreports things, that's no crime. If you'd like to be a lady for the night, I'd be happy to assist.
She smiled.
You're kind, Leyland, but you know, I'm ready. Perhaps I'm curious to see what will happen. Just let me get some food before you start making introductions. If I'm going to be thrown off the ship, I'd rather it was on a full stomach.
A woman after my own heart,
Leyland said, taking a plate.
The black-spiced dragonhawk is excellent, but you simply must try the fish. You'll never get fish as fresh as at a Lirandar feast. I think the deep-scale trout were brought in from the Thunder Sea mere hours ago.
He helped himself to a generous portion of the trout, along with a salad made from watercress and other Martyrs staples. After Lay had filled her plate, Leyland led her over to another table where a few others were already seated.
Odalays, do you mind if I join you?
Not at all.
The speaker was in his mid-years, but lean and handsome. He rose and pulled out a chair for Lay.
And who is your charming companion, Leyland? My name is Lay, my lord, she replied. Former heir of the House of Making, now finding my own way in the world.
It was interesting to watch the man's reaction. There were dozens of physical traits that distinguished the Dragonmark bloodlines. A certain shade of hair or eye, curve of cheek, slant of nose. Each house had thousands of members, and these traits were many and varied. But Lay had paid close attention to the subject in her schooling, and she was fairly certain this man wasn't an heir himself. This is why she'd chosen him as her test subject. For an instant, his eyes widened in surprise. Then they narrowed, and she could see his interest growing. He took her proffered hand, brushing her fingers with dry lips as he gazed into her eyes.
I am Alace Irlantar, he said, and I have the honor of being one of the ambassadors from the nation of Onder. I hope you will not consider the question rude, but do you possess the mark of making?
They considered this for a moment, but saw no harm in the question.
I do.
Fascinating, Alace said.
And what brings you to Sharn?
Lay brushed her fingers across her armor.
I learned the ways of artifice and enchantment as a child, and truly you are one of the most gifted enchantresses I have ever set eyes upon. Magic or no.
Lay wanted to roll her eyes, but she resisted the urge. She'd been in the field for so long that she'd almost forgotten the ways of the court, the constant interplay of simpering flattery. She smiled and cast her eyes to the floor.
Like many members of my house, I served in the support corps during the war. My home was in Metrol, and I understand, Alace said, putting his hand over hers. Truly, the destruction of Seer is a tragedy that has affected us all deeply. At Arcanix, we have the greatest mystical minds of the age studying the disaster, trying to unlock its secrets and ensure that it never happens again. Perhaps you would be interested in a seat on the Arcane Congress. The offer took Lay by surprise, but then she caught scent of where he was going. My lord, that's most gracious of you. But I did not realize that Onder was providing shelter for the refugees of the war. We are a small country, and we do not have the resources of Breland. Otherwise, I can assure you, we would be doing everything in our power to help the scattered people of Seer. But I have no doubt that the Queen would make a special exception in your case, in light of the many difficulties you have overcome, not to mention your loss of status within your own house. Truly, your offer is most kind.
Lay was curious to see how far this would go.
Yet, with the destruction of my home, I find myself without the means to travel. Even shelter itself has been a difficulty.
Alace opened his mouth to speak, but was distracted by the arrival of a servant. The young girl whispered in his ear, and he sighed.
I am afraid I must depart, my lady, he said, pushing back his chair and rising from the table. But why don't you stop by the embassy of Onder in Dragon Towers? I am certain that we could find a way to alleviate your current difficulties. He smiled. I thank you, Lord Alace. Perhaps I shall. Alace bowed and departed, and Leyland glanced at her with a raised eyebrow.
I do not trust him, my lady, said Pierce, who had continued to stand behind her chair throughout the conversation. His eyes followed the departing ambassador. Nor do I, Pierce. Nor do I.
You wouldn't want a seat on the Arcane Congress, Ley, Leyland said. After our time in Arcanix, it might feel like home.
It's a pretty offer, but who knows what the truth would be when I arrived in Onder. It didn't occur to me at first, but I suppose I am an heir to the Mark of Making, with knowledge of the techniques of House Cannith. But I am no longer protected by my house. It wouldn't surprise me if Lord Alace is dreaming about a new Ondarian bloodline carrying the Mark of Making, starting with me.
That seems a little far-fetched, Leyland said. If it was that simple, why hasn't it happened before?
I didn't say it was simple, or even that it was possible. Just that it's what I think the ambassador had in mind. People are rarely forced out of the house, and there is always the hope that you might be reinstated. My Uncle Jura was the only excoriate I've ever met, and I know he's hoping to return to the family. So loyalty plays a role. More importantly, I don't think the barons would allow it to happen.
What do you mean?
Just that. If the house truly thought an excoriate could present a threat to the purity of the bloodline, I've certainly met a few purists who would do whatever they considered necessary to stop it. And that could go a long ways.
So your life, it is in danger then?
Leyland asked. Not if I play by the rules. I'm sure Lord Alace would be happy to protect me in exchange for my cooperation. Of course, but I still don't know why I've been expelled, or if there's a chance for me to return. And for all that I'd like to smash the Baron's faces, I still believe in the ideals of my family. I'll wait to see what happens, she paused thoughtfully. Of course, I am sitting at a table with a gifted augur. Perhaps you'd care to give me some advice? Leyland rubbed his blue beard.
Well, I don't have to be an augur to see financial ruin in my future if I start giving my friends free advice.
Oh, please, she said playfully. At least tell me if I should follow up on this business with Alace. If I become a wealthy lady of Arcanix, I promise to find a place for you there.
He rolled his eyes.
Oh, very well.
He reached into a leather pouch and produced a set of flat blue stones. He spread them across the surface of the table. Each stone was a slightly different color, and they formed a mesmerizing mosaic.
So, what will happen if you accept Alace's invitation?
He stared at the stones, drumming his fingers on the table, a humming method for seeing into the mists of time. After a minute, he stopped, looked over at her, and shook his head.
I think you're right. I can't tell if the threat comes from Onder or your house, but misfortune would certainly follow.
I guess we won't be teaching together at Arcanix then.
That's all right. I still have my hopes set on Morgrave University. I can see myself teaching at some point in the future. Though, from the image I see in the stones, I need to lose a little weight first.
Lay took another bite of the excellent deep-scale trout. In that case, attending these parties can't be helping your cause.
Too true! In any case, as long as I have the stones spread out, I may as well make use of them. Is there anything else I can do for you?
Well, actually, I'm looking for a friend of mine, a halfling named Jode. Can you tell me where to find him?
Pierce spoke up from behind them. Not to intrude, my lady, but if you have confidence in Master Leylin's talents, should we not ask about Raciel Tan?
Right. Good thinking. We're also looking for a man named Raciel Tan, for a friend.
Well,
Leylin said.
This is certainly more complicated question. But let me see what I can do with it. Where are Jode and Raciel? And how can you find them?
He fixed his gaze on the stones and began tapping his fingers again. This time the process took longer, and near the end he closed his eyes for almost a minute. Finally, he stopped humming and tapping and took a deep breath.
It is difficult to see, but I think that your Jode and Raciel are actually together right now, and you will be reunited tonight.
Well, good for Jode, Lay murmured. I guess he had a good lead after all.
It would seem so, Pierce said. If this augury is to be trusted.
Pardon my companion, Leylin. He's never had much faith in such things.
All is forgiven.
Leylin gathered up the stones.
Shall we see what Lyrandar has to offer in the way of dessert?
Even as Lay rose, she noticed a group of people walking toward them. The man in the lead was dressed in martial style. 4 silver lightning bolts adorned his black leather jerkin, and a blue cloak draped his shoulders. His pure white hair and slightly pointed ears hinted at his half-elven blood. As new to Sharn as she was, it was a simple matter for Lay to guess who this was. She curtsied gracefully as he approached. Pierce moved up to stand by her side.
Lord Dantian, I thank you for your hospitality.
Her words were carefully chosen. She didn't like his demeanor, so reminding him that she was a guest seemed a wise move.
You are Lay, formerly of House Cannith?
Dantian's tone was cold, his blue-green eyes unreadable.
I have that honor. I am afraid that I must ask you to leave my ship.
Lay spotted Daisy de Cannith across the room, and the situation became clear.
My lord, I am sorry to hear this. The hospitality of House Lyrandar is legendary. After my long journey, I had hoped to discover the truth to the legends. But I suppose that I have.
Dantian stiffened, but did not swerve from his course.
Your presence is causing discomfort to my other guests, and I am afraid that I must put the needs of the group above those of a single guest, especially one in such reduced circumstances.
He gestured, and 2 armed men in Lyrandar livery stepped forward.
My guards will escort you and your servant to the foredeck. Kadran will see to it that your belongings are returned and that you have transportation.
He raised an eyebrow.
High walls, I believe.
A small crowd had gathered to observe the scene, and a chuckle ran through the masses at this.
That's very kind of you, Lord Dantian. Lay replied. It's good to know that House Lyrandar drives its guests home when it drives them away.
Leyland rose to join her, but Lay pushed him back down.
There's no need for you to get involved in this, she said quietly. Thank you for your help. Pierce, let's go.
The guards led them up the stairs and out onto the main deck. The guests who had been talking beneath the rings had left, and the deck was deserted. Lay looked up at the rings of fire and clouds, and for a moment her thoughts were lost in the swirling steam.
Look out!
Pierce's voice tore her from her reverie. The warning came in the nick of time, and she threw herself forward just as she felt the point of the blade touching her back. Spinning around, she saw Pierce facing the two guards who had drawn their blades. The shorter guard was carrying 2 daggers. He was the one who tried to stab her and failed. He cursed.
Dang it! Deal with the forged! I'll deal with her!
Pierce moved forward in a blur of motion. He grabbed the smaller man, pinning his arms with a grip of steel. But before he could crush the breath from his foe, the second guard stepped up. This man was tall and lanky. While he had a short sword in his right hand, it was the left that he brought to bear, laying his palm on Pierce's back. The Warforged stiffened, let go of his victim, and staggered back a step or two, obviously in great pain. But he'd bought Lay a few moments, and she'd put them to good use. Both guards were wearing chainmail, and as they struggled with Pierce, she'd whispered to the metal of their armor and swords, recalling the heat of the shaping forge. Even as the man with the dagger turned to her, the links of his armor began to glow. He cried out in agony as the searing heat from his daggers raised blisters on his hands. Dropping the weapons, he tore at his armor, trying to tear free before his clothes caught fire. The other guard had escaped the effects of the enchantment, but he had problems of his own. Pierce was back on his feet, and for all that he was unarmed, his fists were stone and steel. Even as the lanky man made a quick thrust at Pierce, the Warforged knocked the blade aside and landed a powerful blow on his jaw. Blood spattered across the deck, and the man staggered back. Lay stepped up to join Pierce, ready to strike, but when their opponent rose to his feet, he turned away and raced for the railing. Pierce charged after him, but too late. The scrawny guard leaped the rail in a single bound and went tumbling over the edge. Even as Pierce peered over the edge, more Lyrandar guardsmen were running toward them. Within mere seconds, a half-dozen swordsmen and a pair of crossbowmen had surrounded them.
"Don't move!"
the sergeant cried, his face livid. Lay just stood, her hands facing out, as the chief servant came running from the foredeck. The smell of burned flesh filled the air. The dagger-wielding guard had succumbed to the terrible heat and was either unconscious or dead.
"What is going on?"
the chief servant cried.
You tell me, Lay said coolly. This man and his companion just tried to kill me. If that's what you have planned for me, then let's get it over with, quickly.
The burned man was lying face down, and the chief servant turned the body over. Lay was surprised. His features were nothing like the man who had attacked her. The servant studied the corpse for a moment.
Sergeant, do you know who this man is?
No. Never saw him before.
The chief servant looked back at Lay, and his expression was grim.
You have the apologies of the house, my lady, and I assure you that we will look into this matter immediately.
If you'd like my assistance, You
and your servant are to leave immediately. A sky coach is waiting at the foredeck along with your belongings.
But
this is a matter for the house. You must leave now.
The guards raised their weapons again, ready to act if ordered. It was clear she had no friends here.
Very well.
The coachman was an unusually dour gnome who had no interest in conversation. He stayed completely silent, keeping his hand on the tiller as they sailed down through the night air to the glittering spires below. This gave Lay the time to focus on Pierce. Laying her hands on his armor, she reached within, tracing the magical web that gave him life. The web was damaged, and in places it had snapped entirely. Physically, Pierce seemed perfectly healthy, but to the eyes of an artificer, it was clear how close he had come to being destroyed. Drawing on the energy of her own spirit, Leia reinforced the threads, patching those that had been cut.
"I don't like this," she said. "Only another artificer could do this much damage. He resisted my heating charm as well."
But he did turn to his sword after the first attack, my lady, Pierce said. Perhaps the power had been placed within him by another, and he was only releasing what he had been given to hold.
"All we really know is that we know nothing. The man who came after me had a glamour concealing his features, so we can assume that Lord Dantian didn't know about it. He wasn't a changeling, though, and nothing about him indicated any sort of connection to our friends in High Walls. As for the other one, given my recent experiences with Dane, while it's possible he chose death over facing you, I imagine he had a feather charm."
Could this have been arranged by a member of your own house, my lady? Your cousin, Daisy?
"Doesn't have the skill or the courage to do this on her own. I don't know. We need to be careful, Pierce."
"I was, lady. The Manticore." The gnome's voice was a mixture of boredom and despair. He brought the coach to a stop just outside the inn, and they clambered out. The instant they had cleared the boat, he rose back into the air.
"Eager to be on his way, I guess,"
Lay said.
"Pierce! Lay!"
It was Dane. He came running down the street toward them, and before they could respond, he wrapped Lay in a powerful embrace.
"Dane?"
she said. Instantly, he let go and took a step back. Even in the dim light, she could see the flush rising in his cheeks.
Sorry,"
he said.
It's been a strange few hours. Was that a sky coach? Where have you been?"
"That's a long story," she said.
"Then you can tell it inside. I don't know about you, but I still haven't had any sort of dinner. Let's see what wonders Dassy has to offer."
The common room of the Manticore was filled with the smell of the evening meal, and Lay thanked the sovereigns she'd been able to dine with the Lerondars. Dassy was serving a thin stew with string meat that Lay guessed to be some sort of lizard, and none too fresh from the smell. Looking around the room, she saw no sign of Jode, but another tiny figure standing in a dark corner caught her eye.
"Rosala?"
said Dane, following Lay's gaze.
"There you are," the goblin girl said. "I thought I might have heard you wrong this morning when you said the place."
While it was difficult for her to avoid being adorable, her voice was level and grim.
"You need to come with me. Now."
"Why?"
Obviously, Dane had trouble placing his trust in a girl who'd picked his pocket just 2 days before.
"You must come and see," Rosala said. "It is about your friend, the little one." "What?"
Lay broke in.
"Where is he?"
"Come and see," Rosala said. She darted out the door of the inn, and they followed.